Kevin, welcome to the stage. You ready for part two? This one comes in English. Give it up for Kevin Bales.
Thank you. That was the most remarkable presentation, even if it was in Norwegian and my thing didn't work. I learned so much. So that's how good this guy is. He and I should actually be doing these talks together, and you're going to see why in a moment. This is a density map of slavery around the world. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through some of these bits. The darkest parts are where you see the highest proportion of a country's population as being in slavery. And you can see that a number of these countries are also those places where there's extreme deforestation, where there are significant problems with climate change. But it also tells us one important thing that you don't notice right away, which is that there's no blank country. We can't find a country without some even small amounts of enslavement or human trafficking. And then in the places like the Congo and India, Pakistan, we know that it's pretty significant, but not as significant as you might think. If you look around the world, one of the things you have to know first to come to understand modern slavery is that the population explosion has created a situation in which the value, the cost of a human being in slavery or trafficking has collapsed. For most of human history, human beings were expensive. They were like buying a car or a house or a lot of livestock. And here's a little, I did this during my own lifetime, as you can see, 4,000 years. But we start 4,000 years ago. And I worked with a number of ancient historians, and we worked out the cost in today's dollars. It was a little tricky when you go back to ancient Greece. But as you can see, when the population began to explode, the cost, the price of a human being collapsed. And we went from a world in which an enslaved person was worth thousands to a point where enslaved people are often just free for the taking, or a tiny amount of money is all that's needed to take control of them. This is, the sound's up on this one. This is just an example of one of these people who become so inexpensive that they're disposable. They're like paper cups that you drink from, and then you crumple them up and throw them away. These boys were tricked to come out and work for a man who had a quarry for stones. Their parents thought that they were going to work for a little bit and get some money in, but when they took them away, they were never taken back. And in fact, what would happen is that, for example, one of the boys would be walking with these heavy stones on their backs down these paths in Nepal. This is all in Nepal. And they would trip, and they would fall down, they would break a leg. The slaveholder who was exploiting them would come to them, take the stone, but leave the boy, because it was less expensive, less trouble to just get a new boy. But the stone was worth more than the boy. This is what I mean by this complete collapse in human beings. It's a paradox, right? And another part of this paradox is that we're at this point in history with this population explosion that the fraction of the people in the world, that it's something like 45 to 50 million people in slavery out of 8 billion, means that we're at this point where we're at the smallest fraction of the human population to be caught up in slavery. And yet, there's this very powerful intersection that we've been discovering at our rights lab, at our special research institute. And not just how slavery is a terrible thing in and of itself, but in the way it drives climate change, the way it fuels wars, and the ways that it, in fact, leads sometimes to genocide. Here's a very, I think this will be a nice surprise for you, because this actually has an answer and possibly a good point if we can get there. If you take the CO2 emissions, you're hearing a lot about CO2 emissions, carbon emissions. China and the United States are the two highest emitters of carbon dioxide. But if you take the work of people in slavery around the world, and we did this very carefully with a big research team based with climate specialists, and you add together the type of work that slaves are forced to do, a great deal of it generates vast amounts of CO2 emissions, and I'll show you why in a moment. So much so that if slavery were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of CO2 in the world after China and the United States. Now that's on one level, I think, terrifying, and on another level, hopeful, because it's a crime. It's a dispersed crime, and it should be able to stop it because it's illegal in every country. A lot of the things that we do to generate CO2 are perfectly legal. We drive automobiles, we burn fires, I mean, whatever it happens to be. But these activities are actually illegal and can be located and stopped. I'll go on with that a bit. Here's a few different ways that slavery, it turns out, is not as bad in itself, but actually then has the impact of other very negative changes. Here's an example. Slavery with illegal deforestation, illegal fishing, species loss. This is all in one scenario. Child slavery, child sexual assault, women shrimp workers. I'll go to a satellite photo. This is taken above the Sundarbans UNESCO World Heritage Site at the bottom of Bangladesh. It's a place that should never be touched by human beings. It's under total protection. It's the last place that Bengal tigers can roam freely. It's the largest carbon sink, and if you don't know the term carbon sink, it means it's where the carbon's actually being sucked out of the air and put back into the ground or to the sea. So it's actually one of the best things the planet can have. It's pulling the carbon out of the air. It's the largest carbon sink in all of Asia. But as you can see on the left side of the picture, there's something going on in this forest. This isn't right. The forest is here on the right side. It's all mangrove forests, mangroves are fantastic trees to pull carbon out of the air. But on the left side, it looks like buildings. It's not buildings. It's actually fish drying racks. And the people who do the cutting and drying of the fish are children who have been lured and tricked away from their parents, taken downriver, they disappear, they end up on these islands, and they have to work day and night. Sometimes they're sexually assaulted as well, to clean and dry these fish, which then often ends up in cat food that comes to Europe and North America. One of the things the things that look like buildings in the first photo are actually these racks where they dry the fish. And one of the photographers that I worked with was a very brave photographer and actually got a photo of a modern slave driver beating children to make them work faster to dry the fish that they could work to. Now, where does this go? One thing that was helpful after we first found this situation in the Sundarbans is happily at our research institute, we have one team that just works with satellites. So we looked and were able to find 8 more of these sites and report them to the Bangladeshi police. They weren't as interested as we hoped they would be. We also found where they were in the past so we can understand the history of this crime. And I'll jump to the next one now. Mining, brickmaking, illegal emissions, again, species loss. This time it's not about fish, it's about bricks. Brick kilns in Asia, in the part of Asia where there is something called the brick belt in India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. There, brickmaking is one of the most powerfully dangerous and dirty and CO2 emitting bits of work, and you'll see why in a moment, that happens in the planet today. It's one of the reasons why Slavery is the third largest emitter of CO2. It comes down to brick making. What happens is, just as a small area, you can see the green circles. Those are brick kilns, pictures of brick kilns taken from space. And you can see something sticking up. That's the chimney where they let off the horrific, poisonous, cancer-causing smokes, because they burn old tires, they burn things that are against the law to burn in Norway or any other country, or most countries, but things that when they do burn them to make the bricks, go into the air and then cause cancer. They're carcinogenic as well as being CO2. Again, we were happy and able to bring our satellites to bear on this, because one of the things we discovered after we had done research about the technology of bricks with people in slavery was that, and I should say to you, whole families are enslaved at brick kilns. Not individuals, but whole families, and they all live there. The children make the mud, the bigger children put the mud into boxes, the older children take that to the kilns to bake it, to make a brick, and so forth. But we didn't know no one knew how many brick kilns there were and how big the problem was. So we used satellite and some AI, some machine learning, to train a computer how to identify brick kilns from space. And it took a little while, and we had lots of people just like you to help us identify brick kilns on a computer screen, and that helped the computer, the machine learning, to understand what they looked like. But at the end of the day, it clicked in and said, okay, I'm ready. I can give me 3 days to run my programming, and I'll tell you how many there are. It turns out 55,387 kilns across Pakistan, Nepal, India, and Bangladesh. That's a vast amount of emissions, enormous amounts of emissions. And one of the reasons why you see dramatic environmental changes going on to the north, just into the Himalayas, where less snow is falling, where things are melting, which haven't melted for generations. And yet, while I'm talking about it in terms of CO2 emissions, every one of those 55,000 brick kilns were a place where up to about 50 people, men, women, and children, would be held in a terrible type of enslavement. Their conditions were very bad. They would be ill from what they're breathing. And of course, as in all types of slavery, the brick kiln owners would be sexually assaulting the women and children and girls. That just goes with the way it goes. Another type of illegal deforestation, another type of illegal emissions, this time in Brazil. In Brazil, this was the first time I actually had this idea come to me. It was in the 1990s. I'm really old, but I was in the 1990s, and I was looking from the forest. I was lying on my stomach with binoculars, looking at this illegal and criminally run site where they are burning the forests inside those clay ovens to make charcoal, not for the barbecue, but for the steel industry in Brazil. And they were enslaving people, young men mostly, who were just looking for a job, and they would say, sure, come here, we'll give you a job. Then they would take them way out into the country, point a gun at them, and say, you work here now, you do exactly what we say. That's the end of the story. But they would burn, you can see the timber cut up, you can see the clay ovens, and then you can see this man is loading charcoal into the back of a truck that will go off to the steel mill. It's a curious repeated vision that when we looked at the children in Bangladesh, we saw how the forest had been cut on one side in that protected UNESCO forest. And here we are in the Pantanal in Brazil, and we can see where The forest has been cut on one side, the forest hasn't been cut yet on the other, and in the middle is a big camp of charcoal making, all run with slave labor. Where does this slave labor go? Where does this charcoal go? Where does the steel industry, what do they do with it once they've made it? I'll show you in just a second. And I'll show you that we can now see deforestation from space as well. And when we link this forest data with the slavery data, and this, I'll tell you, this isn't Brazil, this is Amazonia. So what you're seeing there in terms of a map, that's the Amazon, or certainly the southern half of Amazonia. And you can see what happens over time as well. So that in Brazil, they have wonderful anti-slavery groups, and they also have very scientific anti-slavery groups. And they can tell you the precise locations of things like when there was a murder in a protected forest, or when there were slavery cases in a protected forest. But as you can see, the green parts of the Amazon are the parts that haven't been cut. The yellow parts are the parts that should never have been touched, are supposed to be protected, but have been cut. So the yellow parts are showing us what was the destruction of the Amazon as it moved forward over the last few years. And I have to say, it's worse now, because I made this a few years ago. And under the last Bolsonaro, the terrible president who was something of a criminal, he opened up more of the Amazon. You can also see, because we had GPS locations of murders and slavery cases, that if you look inside the innermost red line, you can see a yellow kind of heart-shaped space with a big blue dot and a whole bunch of red dots around it. And that's where criminal gang went in, used their slave labor, cut all those trees of the Amazon in a big enough space to then take them away. And when they were finished with that space, maybe when the rains came, they killed all the workers, buried them in the rest of the forest, and took away the wood to sell, and so forth. It's a horrific thing. And where does the steel industry in Brazil, what do they make? Well, you know, every day now when you turn on your tap in the bathroom, you know, you're going to say, oh, is this one of those Brazilian? They do a lot of plumbing fixtures, and they do a lot of parts for cars. And this is all exported primarily to North America and to Western Europe. Adly is a word that a lot of people don't know in English. It's the word you use when you don't know what you're supposed to be saying. So adly, the last area that I want to talk about is this intersection between, because it also links to environmental destruction, but between conflict and slavery. So we begin to realize, when I worked some in Eastern Congo, and I was around child soldiers, and I was around people who were being caught up in conflict, I discovered that no one seemed to be reporting the reality of the slavery that was going on inside of wars. So we went to the Uppsala conflict database in Sweden, and we took all of their data and we analyzed it by pulling up each conflict, each 1,113 conflict years for each conflict, and we said, what can we find out about slavery or trafficking in this conflict in this year? And what we discovered was far beyond what I thought we would find. It turns out that there were child soldiers in almost 9 out of 10 conflicts that are going on since 1989. 9 out of 10. Forced labor in under half, sexual exploitation, forced marriage in about a third, and human trafficking, meaning that they capture people during the conflict and then sell them, right? They sell them to raise funds to support their armed conflict. All of that was going on in all of that time. And when I spoke to people in different militaries The Norwegian military, the British military, the American militaries, they were like, slavery? There's slavery in the conflict? They found it astounding, and they're actually now beginning to open up new ways of understanding it because they're realizing they have to retrain their soldiers to understand that the people they're sometimes pointing their weapons at are slaves, are people who are caught in slavery. They're not enemies, they're people caught in slavery. Here's one last example of this. So ISIS, this is the magazine put out online by ISIS. Don't go looking for it online. If you do, the security intelligence forces will come and check your computer because they follow anyone who looks at Dabiq. But notice that they're actually publishing articles about slavery and how it's a good thing and how they could improve the world by having more slavery. This is northern Iraq. You know that ISIS invaded northern Iraq and attacked the Yazidi population up there. It's an ethnic group. It's a wonderful kind of culture. It's not Muslim, it's not Christian, it's not Jewish. They have their own special religion, which I have to just throw this in because since we're in a church, one of the things I love about their religion is that they have a Holy Ghost, which is a giant magical peacock. And that's the main dude in their Trinity, right? So they're like, we talk to the peacock, right? Anyway, I think it's a fascinating group of people, and they're very literate and very interesting and poetic as well. But I'll go ahead and say, what we were able to do and discover was that we were able to obtain a captured enormous pile of ISIS documents from the Yazidi region. And we were able to go through them and analyze exactly how was ISIS using slavery and using other types of terror and murder and genocide to carry out what they do. And if you follow this along, it turned out to be a very clear pattern. So, if they moved into a village, they would take all the men and boys over the age of 12 and they'd kill them, just like that. They would take all the women who were over, say, 50 or even 45, and they would kill them. And then they would begin working through the process of what they would do with the women and girls. Young boys, they sent off for military training and brainwashing. But the women and girls, you can see all of these different pathways to different types of exploitation. Rest houses, it says. That's actually a place where they would be sexually assaulted by soldiers. It's like a prostitution thing, but no payment or anything like that. Sold in markets. They would be sold literally in open markets. But they would also be sold in young women on online auctions. They set up online auctions and sold women all across the Middle East with them bringing in their bids over the internet. You can see there were forced abortions and birth control and so forth, and all kinds of horrific and terrible things. And of course, what they're doing is using this type of enslavement and all these different subtypes of trafficking, exploitation, sexual assault, and so forth, in a process of genocide. Because their ultimate aim was to wipe out the Yazidi people completely. They believed that that God said they should just be wiped out completely because they were, according to ISIS, devil worshippers. From the documents, we were astounded to learn that $2 million a day was flowing into ISIS in northern Iraq because of the way they were selling people especially. And that there was actually a man whose job was called, I am the minister of spoils, of things that we steal, right? And it was bankrolling all of this. Now, well, that's only the bottom half of this particular slide, but that's okay. The thing that I'm getting at with this one is just to say that we actually know about how much it costs to get people out of slavery. and you can take an average. And we also know that in a lot of parts of the world, we have really well worked out liberation methods. In northern India, where people are enslaved, in agriculture, or even in brick kilns, we know exactly how to get them out and how to make it all safe and start them on a new life. And one of the important things about that is that if you study the economics of slavery and post-slavery, in other words, people in slavery and then after they come out, there's always what we call a freedom dividend. So in a community where there's a lot of slavery, you take that slavery away, and the community goes like this economically. It just goes up and up and up because people are free, they can work for themselves, they have their own dreams, they can do all kinds of things that they've always wanted to do. They don't have to give their whole life for nothing, right? Here's one example. We do a lot of work in northern India where there are hundreds and hundreds of villages, sadly, still caught in hereditary slavery. So the families, like these children here, their families were probably tribal people, not people in the caste hierarchy, but people from outside the caste hierarchy. And at one point, sometime in the past, they had come to a village. The local landowner said, "Work for me, I'll pay you well." And then at the end of the season, they said, "Well, actually, you didn't do enough work. You owe me money." It was all a lie, of course. But they are illiterate, they don't know. So they say, "You have to stay. You have to stay on and work another year." That goes on for generations because they don't understand. And after the second or third generation, any knowledge of freedom has disappeared. They live in a tiny village, and the way that we get them out, or help them to come out, is that we start with a school. It's like a Trojan horse. We insert a little school. The teachers are actually ex-slaves from the same types of villages who have been to university and got teacher training. We put in a food program for lunches, which means the slaveholder likes the school because it gives free food for his slaves. But all the time the teachers are talking, all the time the mothers are helping cook, the conversation is beginning, by which they say, ultimately, after a year or two, "You know, I used to live in a village just like this, but now we have a clinic and a school and a library and so forth." And it's always the women who lead in these villages, and they say, "Tell us how to do that." Now, this is just one little group that's of the several groups who are doing that work in northern India. They've done about 50 schools in villages. About 5,500 people have been freed from slavery. In US dollars, it's about $195 per person, which is nothing. To bring a whole person out of slavery and to rebuild their life for, I don't know what that is. Well, in pounds, it's about 140 pounds. It's like, you could do that for a nice meal out, right? If you're well off, I think. Okay. And then there's this notion of carbon credit. Now, carbon credits are controversial because a lot of the time they're being used by and sold by people who just want to plant a bunch of monoculture tree areas, right? But one of the things that we know is that if you take areas of the Amazon and if you were to say, you can say to the people who had been enslaved to cut down the trees, because they're local Brazilians, they know what they're doing, and say, "We could pay you to do that, to replant the Amazon forest," we could pay for it with carbon credits. The carbon credits themselves would easily pay for it because the forest they've been forced to destroy could, if you add up what needs to be replanted now, at the current rate of carbon credits per ton of carbon, there would be about $27 or $28 billion worth of carbon credit out there. It would take a while to run through it all, but that's more than our estimate to bring slavery to an end on the whole planet. This is where this intersection is pretty crazy, right? What we have, we've lost some more of this. That's okay. up at the top of the slide, which is now on the roof of the building, right? It says that it's going to take about 20-some billion maybe to actually bring slavery to an end on the planet Earth if we had that money. And what it says at the lower part of the slide that stayed with us, thank you, is that we only, if you look at all the anti-slavery work around the world, it runs on about $400 million a year, not in the billions, which means if you quickly multiply that times 58, that'll tell you the number you can't see that's on the roof, okay? If we can make it before the eco-collapse, right? Now this is my last one, and the one I wanted to point it out because I've been talking about areas where you can see we've been researching very deeply for several years. But one of our areas of research, which has only been going on a year or so, is looking at the size, the power, the influence, and the reach of religious groups. What we're finding is that if you look across the planet and you say, who's doing something about slavery, religious groups are the ones who are actually doing the most, but talking the least. So there's a Roman Catholic organization, for example, just of religious sisters, nuns who wear habits, have the special clothes, who always live together, who don't take salaries, who are devoted their entire lives to the work. Last year, in their little report on what they did, they had brought about 500,000 people out of slavery, globally. But you had to dig to find them. And it's hard to even get a conversation with them. But we're beginning to understand that if we understand how to restore the environment on one hand, which will reduce the power of this catastrophe that is on our front of our faces, and we begin to rebuild economies in people's lives with liberation and reintegration, it's probably going to be standing on the foundation of the faith groups that does the most. Government programs come and go. Charities rise and fall. Well-meaning philanthropists think, oh, this is a great idea, and they give you a couple of million, and then the next year they say, no, it's actually tulips that I want to give money. You don't know what they're going to do. We need something that's solid and stable to make this go along. We could start in those places, especially where the armed conflict isn't happening, like at the World Heritage Site in Amazonia, the West African rainforests, the mountain forests. Those would be good places to start, where you wouldn't have to worry about conflict as well. Okay, that's what I wanted to tell you and what I wanted to surprise you with and show you how there's actually this really tight relationship between what goes on with slavery and what goes on with environmental destruction and CO2. And I think the more of us that understand that you can fight global warming by helping people out of slavery. You can help people out of slavery by fighting global warming. And that's at least broadening and opening our opportunities. And I like to think of it as opportunities, even though it's ugly, it's harsh, it's mean, it's cruel, it's a hard pill to swallow. But if we do swallow it, we might get a world where the temperatures don't hit the maximums. And we might get a place, live on a planet, where only, hopefully no one has to live a life totally controlled and abused by another person. Okay, thank you so much.